That night, as the Oregon forest was swallowed by darkness and the blizzard howled like a demon, a gunshot shattered the silence. An old man with blood-soaked shoulders, a deaf little girl trembling in despair, and a husky lunging into the kidnapper through the raging snowstorm. This wasn't just a rescue. This was fate, life, and sacrifice. The snow had begun falling long before dusk, thick and silent, layering the world in white so pure it looked unreal. The Oregon forest loomed like a cathedral of skeletal pines, each branch trembling under the mounting weight of fresh powder. Somewhere within that labyrinth of trees, a thin ribbon of footsteps cut through the pristine drifts, weaving back and forth in a pattern of panic. Sophia Miller ran until her lungs burned. Every breath she sucked in felt like shards of glass cutting down her throat, and the freezing air stabbed at her eyes until tears formed and hardened on her lashes. Her feet slid with every step on the icy underbrush, but she didn't dare slow down. Her small fists pumped at her sides, clumsy in soaked wool mittens. Her red scarf flapped violently behind her, a bright wound of color against the blank canvas of snow. She couldn't hear her own footsteps crunching, couldn't hear the wind screaming between the trees or the frantic pounding of her heart. For Sophia's sound was a dim vibration, at best dulled by the world she'd always known, one of muffled voices and trembling lips that never formed words she could hear, but she could feel. The tremor of the earth beneath her boots, the rhythm of her pulse, the terror crawling like fire ants across her chest. The cold was so deep now it gnawed at the marrow of her bones, and each time she stumbled it took longer to stand up again. Her knees buckled beneath her, scraping against frozen pine needles, leaving thin red lines against pale skin. She didn't cry out, she couldn't, but her mouth opened in a silent sob. She thought of her mother, her brother, the pale blue bedroom where a stuffed bunny waited on her pillow. She thought of warmth, of cinnamon oatmeal, before school of the light above the kitchen sink that her mother never turned off until everyone was home safe. She was not safe. She was alone. Behind her, dim and shifting in the gloom, shadows twisted between trunks. Snow blurred everything in drifting curtains, but Sophia sensed him. Russell Carter. She felt him as if his eyes pressed against her back, crawling across her like cockroaches. In her mind, she could still see his smile, gentle and trembling, as he whispered to her in that dark concrete room underground. "You're my little angel, Emily. My gift from God. I won't let them take you away again." Emily, the name he called her over and over, stroking her hair with a trembling hand as tears streaked his cheeks. But Sophia was not Emily. She was Sophia Miller, 9 years old, and she wanted to go home. She wanted her mother's arms around her, not the cold touch of a broken man who saw ghosts in little girls' faces. She tripped again. This time she didn't get up right away. She rolled onto her back, gasping. Snow fell on her face, filling the curve of her lips, melting down her throat in tiny icy rivulets. Above her, pine branches rattled in the wind, sending down sprays of powder. Her chest rose and fell rapidly beneath her puffy pink coat. She blinked at the swirling flakes, wondering if she would ever see real stars again, instead of this endless curtain of white. A noise vibrated through the earth, a distant low rumble she couldn't hear, but felt in her bones. She twisted onto her side, forcing her numb limbs to obey, and crawled behind a fallen log, half buried under snow. Her breath came in ragged gasps, puffing clouds of vapor that dissipated into the storm. She pressed her back to the rough bark, closed her eyes, and tried to disappear. Miles away, Ethan Walker sat in silence. The kind of silence so complete that it rang in his ears like a forgotten bell tower. The log cabin around him creaked softly under the weight of accumulating snow on its pitched roof. Sparks popped from the fire burning in the stone hearth, sending embers skittering across blackened logs. The only light in the room came from that fire, dancing orange and gold over pine-paneled walls lined with dusty hunting trophies and framed photographs long-turned sepia. Ethan's broad shoulders slumped under a thick wool sweater, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms marked by old scars and fading tattoos. His hands were rough, and square fingers curled loosely around a chipped ceramic mug. Steam no longer rose from the coffee within. It had long since gone cold. His gray hair was uncombed, curling above ears reddened by a life spent outside. He stared into the flame's eyes, distant, as if watching a memory replay for the 1,000th time. Behind him, stretched out across an old braided rug, lay Blaze. The husky's thick fur shimmered in firelight. A mix of smoky grays and crisp white ears pricked slightly forward, even in sleep. His tail curled tight around his hind legs, nose buried beneath its plume. He snored softly, chest rising and falling with each steady breath. The storm battered against the windows, rattling the panes in their wooden frames. Ethan didn't flinch. He was used to storms. Inside him it stormed every day. He thought about his son David. A man grown now with a family of his own somewhere in Montana. Ethan hadn't spoken to him in over a decade. The last words between them had been shouted, not spoken. About pride, about honor, about a father's failures and a son's rage. Ethan wondered, as he often did, if David would care when he died out here. If he would come to bury his bones beneath the trees, or simply let the wolves do it. He sighed, rubbing a calloused hand over his face. The fire crackled. The wind howled, and Blaze lifted his head. It was sudden, a shift in the room's invisible currents. Blaze's ears snapped forward, eyes sharpening from amber dreams to crisp focus. He sniffed the air, then rose in one fluid motion. His claws clicked against the old wood floor as he stepped forward, hackles raising along his spine. Ethan blinked out of his trance, looking down at the dog. "What is it, boy?" Blaze didn't look at him. His gaze locked on the door-nose, twitching body tense with an ancient knowing. Then he let out a single piercing howl, a sound so full of wild sorrow that it sent chills down Ethan's arms. "Hey!" Ethan barked, standing quickly. Pain lanced through his hip, old arthritis flaring. "Blaze, wait." But the dog was already moving. In 2 strides, he crossed the room, his muscular shoulders brushing against Ethan's knees. His breath steamed in short, urgent bursts. Without hesitation, he pawed at the door, whining low in his throat, then let out another howl that rattled the window glass. Ethan cursed under his breath, setting down his mug on the hearth ledge with a clack. He moved to the door, grabbing his heavy canvas coat from a peg on the wall. The zipper stuck halfway down, snagged on frayed lining, and he yanked it free with a growl of frustration. Blaze pawed harder, his claws scraping paint. "Hold on," Ethan muttered. "Damn it, just hold on." He bent to lace his old boots, fingers clumsy and stiff. His shoulders ached with every breath. Outside, the wind roared louder, shaking the cabin in its frozen grip. Blaze whined again, pressing his nose to the crack between door and frame, ears laid flat in anxious urgency. Ethan grabbed his flashlight from the shelf by the door, checked the battery with a flick. The yellow beam cut across the room, revealing dust motes dancing in the frigid air. He clipped it to his belt, then reached for the .38 revolver holstered above the coat rack. He hesitated, staring at it in the dim glow of the fire. He hadn't fired a weapon in years. The sight of it brought back memories that stung like alcohol on a wound. With a grimace, he strapped the holster around his hips, the weight familiar and unwelcome. Then he threw the deadbolt and opened the door. The storm hit him like a wall. Snow whipped sideways, biting into his exposed skin with microscopic needles. The forest beyond his porch was a swirling maelstrom of white shadows and black tree trunks. Blaze surged forward into the night, his form swallowed instantly by drifting flurries. "Blaze!" Ethan shouted after him, but the wind shredded his voice into meaningless fragments. He stepped onto the porch, boots crunching on the thin crust of ice. The cold cut straight through his jeans, making his knees ache. He raised a hand to shield his eyes, squinting into the blizzard's fury. But Blaze was gone. Only the faintest traces of paw prints led away from the steps, disappearing into the storm-swept darkness beyond. "God damn it!" he whispered, fear punching through the numb detachment that had guarded his heart for years. Something was wrong. Blaze had never acted like this, not even when black bears lumbered too close to the cabin or coyotes howled from the ridges above. This was different, urgent, desperate. He stepped down into the snow, feeling it collapse beneath his weight, sinking him to his shins. Wind tore at his coat, whipping the hood back from his face. Ice crystals burned across his cheeks, nestling in his beard. He clenched his jaw teeth, rattling with cold, and began to follow the dim indentations left by Blaze's paws. The world was silent, save for the scream of the wind and the pounding of his heart. Trees loomed around him, spectral and faceless. Shadows moved and twisted between trunks, flickering with every sweep of his flashlight. The beam caught on drifts of blowing snow, reflecting back at him in blinding sheets of white. He moved as quickly as his aging body allowed, breath coming in ragged plumes, fogging the frigid air. His knees burned with each step, his hip flared hot with pain, but he forced himself forward. Somewhere ahead, unseen in the fury of the blizzard, a little girl lay curled beneath a fallen tree, waiting for the dark to swallow her whole. Somewhere ahead, Blaze ran without fear, driven by a loyalty that no storm could sever. Somewhere ahead, fate shifted its hidden threads, drawing 3 broken souls toward each other in a night that would change them forever. Ethan didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that his dog was gone into the storm and that he would follow him no matter where it led. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, hunched his shoulders against the shrieking wind, and stepped into the blizzard's white abyss. Ethan Walker moved through the storm like a man walking into war. The wind roared in his ears, a relentless banshee wail that clawed at his hood and rattled his teeth. Each step plunged him deeper into the drifts, the snow rising nearly to his knees now. But he pressed forward, eyes narrowed against the searing cold. For the first 100 yards, all he could think about was Blaze. That dog was his only family left, the only living creature who didn't recoil from his presence or avoid his eyes. But as the storm swallowed him, as darkness closed in around the thin circle of his flashlight beam, memories began to claw their way up from the depths where he had buried them. The first memory was of Lynn. She had smelled like vanilla and wood smoke, her hair always tied back in a loose ponytail that brushed her collar. The day they met was hot, and loud sirens screaming, the world flickering with red and blue, as Ethan tackled a dealer through a collapsing fence in Portland's South End. He'd come up bleeding furious, only to see her standing there, behind the police tape paramedic kit slung over one shoulder, eyes so clear and calm that he forgot his pain instantly. That was 38 years ago. Back when he still believed in heroes, back when he still believed he could be one. They'd married in the fall, leaves turning gold pumpkin pie cooling on the kitchen window ledge. David came a year later, all red-faced fury and squalling lungs. Ethan remembered the way Lynn pressed the baby into his arms, her smile soft and exhausted. "He's so small," Ethan whispered, afraid he'd break the child just by holding him. "Small things grow strong when they're loved," she replied. He tried to love them. He really did. But work bled him dry. Graveyard shifts, shootings, stabbings, meth labs exploding in the dead of night. The world was a savage place, and every day he walked its bleeding edges. He came home with blood on his boots, gun oil on his breath, and shadows under his eyes. Lynn would kiss him softly, brushing her fingers down his jaw to wipe away the invisible grit of death that clung to him. David would toddle up squealing, only to flinch when Ethan's booming voice barked too sharply. The boy learned early that silence was safer around his father. Ethan tried to teach him strength. "The world doesn't care about your tears, son," he'd say again and again, as if repetition could forge truth. "You stand up, you grit your teeth, you move forward. That's how men survive." But David wasn't like him. He was soft-spoken, gentle, always reading, drawing, asking questions about birds and insects and trees. Ethan didn't know what to do with a boy like that. He tried to toughen him up with discipline drills, lessons in situational awareness and tactical strategy. By 12, David could field strip a Glock blindfolded. By 15, he refused to touch a gun again. Their fights became volcanic. Ethan's voice booming through the house, David's trembling rage like glass shattering on tile. Lynn tried to stand between them, but Ethan saw the cracks in her eyes each time. The pain of loving two men at war. Then came the accident. Winter morning, black ice, a logging truck jackknifed on Highway 20. Lynn was in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the time Ethan reached the hospital, her body was cold under the sheet. He never forgave himself. David never forgave him either. "You were supposed to pick her up," David screamed at him, at the funeral voice cracking in the bitter wind. "You were supposed to be there." "I had shift extension," Ethan muttered, eyes empty. "She called you for a jump start, Dad. Her battery died." "You didn't answer. You didn't answer." David left that night, duffel bag slung over his thin shoulders. Tears freezing on his cheeks. Ethan watched him disappear down the snow-slick road until taillights vanished into darkness. That was 15 years ago. 15 winters of silence. The wind howled louder now, ripping him from memory. His flashlight flickered against drifts of swirling white illuminating tree trunks like skeletal sentinels. Somewhere out there, Blaze was running. His paws were swift and sure, his instincts honed by generations of wolf blood. But still, a dog couldn't think like a man. A dog didn't know the dangers that lurked in the human heart. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts, fogging the air before him. His hip burned with each step, the old injury flaring from cold and exertion. But he pressed on, gripping his flashlight tighter, as if it alone tethered him to reality. Another memory rose unbidden. Blaze, 6 years earlier. Ethan had been out hunting elk near the eastern ridges, picking his way through dense underbrush, when he heard whimpering from a thicket. At first he thought it was a coyote pup caught in a snare, but when he pushed aside the branches, he saw the dog. Thin as bone fur, matted with blood and dirt, a rusted chain digging deep into his neck. His eyes were wild with pain, and hunger muzzle twisted in a silent snarl of fear. Ethan could see ribs beneath the gray and white coat, could see the way his front leg buckled with each frantic jerk against the chain. "Easy now," Ethan murmured, kneeling down. The dog growled, lips curled back, but there was no force behind it. Just terror. Ethan reached out slowly, letting the dog sniff his gloved fingers. His nose was cracked and bleeding, but he still sniffed, still wanted to know if Ethan was friend or foe. "It's okay, boy," Ethan said softly, voice rough from disuse. "Ain't gonna hurt you." He used bolt cutters to snap the chain, the metallic ping ringing through silent trees. The dog flinched, but didn't bolt. Instead, he collapsed sideways, sides heaving with exhaustion. Ethan carried him out of the woods that day, his own back screaming with each step, and laid him in the front seat of his truck. On the drive home, the dog rested his head against Ethan's thigh, eyes closed, trusting. He named him Blaze. Not for fire, but for the thin streak of white that ran from his nose, up between his eyes, like a trail marker blazed onto tree bark by rangers. A sign to follow. A sign of the way home. Over the years, Blaze grew strong. His fur thickened his ribs, disappeared beneath layers of lean muscle. His eyes stayed bright and clever, always watching Ethan, always knowing what he needed before he even spoke. When nightmares woke Ethan in the dead of night, Blaze was there, pressing his warm muzzle against Ethan's clenched fists until they relaxed. When the loneliness threatened to drown him, Blaze would curl beside him by the fire, sharing his heat without judgment or demand. Blaze never asked questions about the past, never flinched from his scars, never spoke words he didn't mean. He was, Ethan often thought, the only creature God put on earth purely to love, without condition. Snow pelted Ethan's face, stinging his eyes, biting his cheeks. He stumbled over a buried root, catching himself against the trunk of a tree. Bark tore his glove, scraping skin. He grunted, sucking air through clenched teeth, then pushed away from the tree and kept moving. The flashlight beam wavered, slicing through the dark like a dying star. His breath fogged in great ragged clouds, drifting away into nothingness. He hated the world beyond these trees, hated its noise and chaos, hated its lies and politicians and preachers who sold hope like snake oil. Out here, in the silence of snow and stone, truth was simple. You lived, you died. The world turned. It didn't care about your grief or your dreams. Out here, you didn't have to pretend you were better than your mistakes. You just were. Blaze understood that. That was why Ethan trusted him. The only one he trusted. A sudden gust of wind tore back his hood, exposing his ears to the frigid air. He hissed, grabbing for it, but the cold clawed down his neck into the collar of his sweater. His skin prickled with ice crystals as he yanked the hood back up. The flashlight flickered again, sputtered, then steadied. He checked the revolver at his hip, fingers brushing cold metal. The old leather holster creaked as he adjusted its position. He hadn't fired it in years, but his hands still remembered the weight, the balance, the precise angle of trigger pull. Memories surged, flashing lights, barking commands, the shock of recoil. Blood blooming dark on concrete. Ethan shook his head, snow shaking loose from his hood. Focus. Blaze was out here somewhere, and Ethan wouldn't let the storm keep him from the only living soul he had left. He raised the flashlight, its beam cutting across the skeletal branches, the drifting white. Snowflakes glowed like falling embers in the yellow light. He took a deep breath, tasting cold and pine sap on his tongue. The scent of winter. The scent of death and life intertwined. Then he moved forward into the screaming dark, following the thin trail of paw prints that wove through the fresh snow. Blaze was out there. And Ethan Walker, for all his failures, for all his bitterness and anger and regret, would follow him to the ends of the earth. Because in the end, it was never about redemption. Never about forgiveness. It was about love. And love, as Ethan had learned too late, was the only thing worth dying for. Darkness pressed down on Sophia like a smothering hand. She sat curled against a concrete wall, knees drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped tight around them. Her wrists burned where nylon cords bit into her skin, rough and unyielding, leaving angry red grooves that pulsed with each frantic thud of her heart. The basement smelled of damp earth and rusted metal. Water dripped somewhere in the far corner with the clockwork precision of a ticking bomb. Drip, drip, drip. The floor beneath her was cold enough to sting through her jeans, seeping into her bones until her legs ached with numbness. She couldn't hear the drip. Couldn't hear the echoing creaks of wooden beams above her, or the low groan of wind rattling the rotting window frames. But she felt it. Felt vibrations shiver through her feet with every drop. Felt the trembling hum of footsteps when he moved around upstairs. Russell Carter, He descended the splintered steps slowly, as he always did, each tread sagging under his weight. She watched him come down, eyes narrowed, breathing fast through her nose. He ducked beneath a dangling light bulb that swung gently from a frayed cord, casting flickering shadows across his face. He carried a metal tray, its edges smeared with dried soup. Today's meal was cold oatmeal clumped in a chipped blue bowl. A bent plastic spoon was stuck into its gluey mass like a snapped mast of a sinking ship. Russell set the tray down on a battered wooden chair across the room, then turned to her with a smile that made her stomach cramp. "My little angel," he said softly. His voice was hoarse, the words slurred by disuse or madness, she couldn't tell which. "Emily, are you hungry today?" Sophia didn't answer. She kept her gaze locked on his chest, refusing to meet his eyes. Tears threatened to spill again, but she swallowed them down. Crying made him angry, or worse, made him sad. She didn't know which reaction was more terrifying. He crouched in front of her knees, popping with emotion. His coat smelled like sweat and wet leaves, tangy and suffocating. Greasy brown hair fell across his forehead in limp strings. A jagged white scar bisected his right cheek, splitting his face in two like cracked porcelain. When he smiled, only half his mouth moved. "I know it's cold down here," he whispered, reaching out with trembling fingers to stroke her cheek. She flinched away, pressing herself tighter to the wall. The nylon bit deeper into her wrists, but she barely felt it through the numbness spreading up her arms. "But it's safer here, Emily. Safer than out there with them. You know that, right?" Sophia closed her eyes. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she felt dizzy. Emily. That name again. She wanted to scream, "My name is Sophia," but her voice stayed trapped behind locked teeth. Russell sighed. His breath smelled like stale coffee and rotting teeth. "You're still mad at me. I understand. You think I'm bad. You think I'm like them." His fingers clenched into fists, knuckles whitening. "I'm not like them. They took you away from me. They took everything." He stood abruptly, the motion jerky violent. The light bulb swung harder shadows, jittering across the walls like fleeing ghosts. He paced in a tight circle, muttering to himself, hands flailing in broken gestures. Sophia forced her eyes open, blinking through the sting of tears. Her gaze darted to the rope binding her ankles. It had loosened slightly when she'd shifted away from his touch. Just a fraction. Just enough. She flexed her toes, testing the give in the knot. The frayed ends brushed against her socks. Her pulse quickened a hot rush of hope, almost too painful to bear. Russell stopped pacing suddenly. His shoulders sagged, the anger bleeding out as quickly as it had risen. He turned to her again, and for a moment his eyes softened, went glassy with tears. "I just want you to be happy, Emily," he whispered. "I just want to keep you safe." Then he turned away, climbing the steps with slow, dragging movements. The door creaked shut above her. A bolt slid into place with a metallic thunk she couldn't hear but felt through the floor. Sophia waited. 1 minute, 2, 10, until her lungs burned from holding her breath. Then she moved. She twisted her ankles back and forth, scraping the rope against the edge of the old metal cot frame beside her. The frayed nylon snagged on rust. She wrenched harder, ignoring the tearing pain as fibers bit into her skin. Her hands trembled with adrenaline sweat slicking her palms despite the frigid air. Finally, the rope snapped. She froze, breath coming in shallow pants, waiting for footsteps above. Nothing. Silence. She bent forward, teeth gripping the cords binding her wrists. The nylon tasted of mildew and dirt. She bit down, grinding it between her molars, pulling back sharply. It didn't break, but it stretched just enough to slip her left hand free. Her fingers burned as circulation returned in painful pins and needles. She ripped the remaining rope away, skin peeling where it had cut deepest. Her hands shook violently, but she forced them still. Forced herself to stand. The room swayed around her. Black spots floated in her vision. She pressed a palm to the damp concrete wall, steadying herself. Her legs felt thin and hollow like reeds, bending in the wind. She took one step, then another, each movement a prayer. The wooden stairs loomed before her. Every tread was splintered and warped. She placed her bare foot on the first step, wincing as a shard of wood bit into her heel. She didn't stop. Up, up, up. Her small hands grasped the rails, pushing her forward. At the door, she pressed her ear against the peeling paint, feeling for vibrations. Nothing. She turned the knob. It moved with a soft scrape. The door cracked open an inch, then another. Beyond was a narrow hallway lined with sagging shelves. Glass jars filled with cloudy water and pickled vegetables gathered dust. A single bulb flickered overhead, its hum vibrating through the wooden beams. To her right was another door slightly ajar. A pale glow flickered from within firelight, or perhaps a lantern. She stepped into the hallway, breath caught in her throat. Every floorboard threatened to groan beneath her weight. She moved lightly toes first, placing each foot with careful deliberation. The front door was ahead. Rusted hinges, a tarnished brass knob. The bolt was undone. Her heart soared. Her chest expanded with a rush of hope so sharp it almost felt like pain. She reached out, fingers brushing cold metal. "Emily," she froze. Russell stood in the doorway to her right. His eyes were wide with shock, mouth trembling open. In his right hand, he clutched a tarnished hunting rifle. The barrel dipped toward the floor, then rose slowly, unsteadily, until it pointed at her chest. "Emily," he whispered, voice breaking. Tears pooled in his bloodshot eyes, streaking down his scarred cheek. "Why are you leaving me? I did everything for you. Everything." Sophia didn't think. She moved. She bolted for the door, hand closing around the knob. The floorboard screamed beneath her feet. Russell howled an animal sound of grief and rage, and the rifle came up. There was no time to open the door gently. She slammed her shoulder into it, splinters slicing into her skin as the door burst open. Cold wind slammed into her, snatching the breath from her lungs. Snow blinded her, instantly swirling in furious sheets that erased everything beyond arm's reach. She stumbled forward, boots crunching through fresh powder, then slipped and fell to her knees. Ice bit through her jeans, numbing her shins. She scrambled back to her feet, gasping. A muffled shout came from behind. She turned. Russell burst through the doorway, rifle raised. His silhouette loomed dark and jagged against the pale rectangle of light from the cabin. He screamed something, but the wind tore the words away before they reached her. Then he raised the rifle to his shoulder. Sophia ran. The world became a chaos of white and black. Her breath tore in and out of her chest, a ragged saw through tender flesh. She stumbled over hidden roots, caught herself on frozen branches that ripped her palms open. The forest closed around her trees, huddling close, their skeletal limbs clawing at her coat. Snowflakes stung her eyes like shards of glass. In her mind, there was no thought. Only the pounding rhythm of her heart. Only the primal scream of survival. "Run! Run! Run!" The beam of his flashlight cut through the storm, swinging wildly across tree trunks. It found her for a fraction of a second, illuminating her wide, terrified eyes, her blood-smeared cheek, before she darted behind a fallen log. A gunshot cracked through the blizzard. Snow exploded beside her, spraying her face with ice and dirt. She bit down on her screen, clapping her hands over her ears, though she couldn't hear the blast. Her body felt the shockwave, the way thunder rattled her bones. She crawled forward, pressing her belly to the snow heart, hammering so fast it hurt. The flashlight beam swung past again, illuminating the steam rising from her breath. She pressed her face into the snow, willing herself to disappear, to become part of the earth, cold and silent and unseen. The light paused. She heard nothing, but felt the shift in the air as he drew closer. Tears froze on her lashes. Her body trembled so violently, she thought her bones would shatter. Then the light moved on, sweeping back and forth across the trees beyond her. She waited, holding her breath, until black spots bloomed behind her eyelids. Then she rose slow and silent and ran again into the screaming dark. Behind her, Russell Carter roared her name into the storm. His voice carried through the night like a dying animal, broken and desperate. "Emily, Emily, come back to me." But Sophia did not look back. She ran into the white chaos toward a freedom she couldn't yet see, her body driven by a primal will stronger than fear. Somewhere far ahead, a dog was running. And fate was running with him. Snow fell in thick, suffocating sheets, each flake a tiny blade cutting into Sophia's exposed skin. Her breath tore in and out of her chest in ragged gasps, burning her throat with each desperate inhale. Her legs had long since stopped feeling like her own. They moved stiffly beneath her, jerking forward in clumsy lurches, each step a battle against the screaming wind. Her vision blurred at the edges, tunneling down to a narrow circle of darkness, ringed by flickering white. The trees loomed like monstrous shadows, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky in silent screams. Somewhere behind her, Russell Carter's flashlight swung back and forth, its harsh beams slicing through the storm like a blade. His voice was a dim vibration in her chest, roaring her stolen name into the storm, each syllable laced with grief and madness. "Emily, Emily, come back to me." But Sophia didn't look back. Couldn't look back. Her entire being was focused forward on the vague, half-remembered memory of light warmth home. The thought of her mother's face blurred with the snow, her brother's laugh, lost to the wind. All that remained was the instinctive drive to keep moving. to survive. Then her foot caught on a hidden root buried beneath the drifts. She pitched forward with a sharp cry that tore from her throat like a wounded animal. Snow exploded around her as she hit the ground hard, the impact rattling her teeth. Pain shot through her knee where it struck a buried stone, radiating up her thigh in hot pulsing waves. She lay there, face pressed into the icy powder lungs, heaving with silent sobs. Her fingers clawed at the snow, trembling so violently she couldn't make them close into fists. The world dimmed around her, darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision. Her heart thundered, then staggered, then thundered again, slower this time. Heavy, exhausted. She tried to move, to push herself up onto her elbows, but her arms buckled beneath her, dumping her face first back into the snow. Tears slid from her eyes, freezing instantly against her lashes. Her entire body shivered with cold, so deep it felt like knives buried in her bones. She was done. There was no fight left. The darkness was warm, gentle, welcoming. She closed her eyes, letting her mind drift away on the rising tide of unconsciousness. Images flickered behind her lids, her mother's smile, her brother's hand in hers. The pale blue walls of her room, the stuffed bunny waiting on her pillow. "Mommy," she whispered, though no sound came from her cracked lips. "I'm sorry. I tried." Then through the haze of swirling snow and death's quiet call, a sound cut through the void. A bark, sharp, piercing, alive. Her eyes fluttered open. Tears blurred her vision, but she saw movement through the haze, a dark shape bounding through the snow with fluid, powerful strides. For a moment, her fading mind thought it was a wolf come to finish her, to sink its teeth into her throat and drag her down into the earth. But then the shape drew closer, and she saw the flash of white fur, the bright amber eyes, the black nose dusted with snow. The creature skidded to a halt beside her powerful paws, kicking up drifts of powder. It lowered its massive head, sniffing at her face with rapid, urgent breaths. Warm, moist air puffed against her frozen cheek as the creature huffed, and she felt the coarse tickle of whiskers against her skin. Another bark, this one closer, sharper, as if commanding her to wake up. A low whine followed, vibrating through the frozen ground and into her bones. She blinked rapidly, tears spilling down her temples as she forced her eyes to focus. A dog, a husky. Thick fur mottled in gray and white ears pricked forward, eyes sharp and intelligent, blazing with a fierce protective light. Its massive chest heaved with each breath, misting the air around them with bursts of steam. Snow clung to its legs and belly, but it didn't seem to feel the cold at all. The dog lowered its nose again, pressing it firmly against her cheek. Its breath was hot, smelling faintly of earth and pine needles. The contact grounded her, pulling her back from the drifting edge of darkness. Tears broke free from her eyes, sliding down into the snow. She tried to speak, but her lips were numb, her tongue heavy and clumsy in her mouth. Only a broken sob emerged, trembling and weak. The dog whimpered softly in response. Then it stepped closer, pressing its massive body against hers, curling slightly to block the screaming wind. Its fur was thick and warm against her frozen skin, radiating heat like a living furnace. The creature lowered its head again and licked her cheek, long, slow strokes that melted the frost clinging to her eyelashes. A sob broke free from her chest, ragged and raw. She reached out with trembling hands, fingers curling into the thick ruff of fur around its neck. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, it pressed closer, wrapping her in its warmth. She buried her face in its fur, silent tears soaking into the dense undercoat. The dog smelled of wild earth and clean snow and something deep and comforting like home. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sophia felt safe. Truly, completely safe. The dog rumbled deep in its chest, a sound somewhere between a growl and a purr. Then it lifted its head ears and flicking forward sharply. Its entire body went tense, muscles coiling beneath its thick pelt. Sophia felt the shift immediately, the sudden focus that vibrated through its frame. The dog barked again, this time louder, sharper, its voice cutting through the storm like a gunshot. It twisted its head, looking back over its shoulder into the darkness behind them. Snow whipped around its face, swirling in angry flurries, but the dog didn't flinch. It barked again, then let out a low, urgent whine. Its eyes flicked back to Sophia, burning bright with determination, then back to the darkness, back and forth, back and forth. She understood. Even in her haze of exhaustion and cold and fear, she understood. It wasn't alone. Someone else was out there. Someone it was calling to. The dog shifted, nudging her shoulder with its nose, as if urging her to stand. She tried, but her legs refused to obey, crumpling beneath her weight. Tears spilled down her cheeks, again hot and bitter, mixing with the melting snow. "I can't," she whispered, though she couldn't hear her own voice. "I can't." The dog barked sharply, almost angrily, then pressed its massive head beneath her arm, lifting. Its powerful shoulders rose, bracing her up. For a moment she wobbled, nearly tipping sideways, but the dog shifted again, planting its paws wide and steadying her with its body. Slowly, inch by inch, she rose to her knees, leaning heavily against the animal's warmth. Her head spun, black spots dancing in her vision, but the dog's presence anchored her, pulling her back from the brink. She buried her face in its fur again, breathing in its wild, earthy scent. The dog lifted its head and howled. A long, piercing cry that rolled through the trees like thunder, echoing out into the storm. It was a sound of power, of defiance, of hope. The forest fell silent for a moment, as if holding its breath in reverence. Then from somewhere far off in the swirling darkness, another sound answered. A human voice, low and rough, carried on the screaming wind. "Blaze." The dog's ears snapped forward at the name. It barked once sharply, tail lifting in an arc of confidence and purpose. Then it turned its head to Sophia, eyes locking onto hers with fierce intensity. For a moment she thought it might leave her, run back to the voice calling it. But instead it pressed closer, wrapping her small, trembling form in its warmth. Another bark, this one loud and sharp, echoing through the trees. Its breath steamed in the freezing air. Its tail thumped once against her side, reassuring grounding. Then it howled again, longer this time, its voice splitting the night, a living beacon, cutting through the storm's suffocating grip. Sophia clung to it, sobbing silently into its fur. Her tears came faster now, unstoppable, as relief and terror and exhaustion crashed over her in waves. She didn't know who was coming, didn't know if they could save her. But she knew one thing, with absolute certainty. She wasn't alone anymore. The dog shifted again, its massive frame tense with alertness. It let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through her bones, then barked 3 short, sharp commands into the night. Somewhere behind them, the voice called out again, louder this time. "Closer." "Blaze, where are you, boy?" The dog's ears flicked back, and for the first time, Sophia saw the shimmer of pure hope in its bright amber eyes. Then it lowered its head, pressed its nose to her cheek once more, and whined softly. A gentle, urgent plea. "Hold on, just a little longer." And in that moment, as the storm raged around them, and darkness pressed close, Sophia believed she could. Because this creature, this living flame of loyalty and courage, would not let her die here. Not tonight, not alone. The wind howled like a living thing, whipping through the skeletal trees with an unearthly scream. Snow lashed Ethan's face in stinging sheets, searing his exposed skin with a cold so deep it felt like burning. His breath came in ragged gasps, pluming thickly into the swirling darkness before vanishing into nothingness. He paused for a moment, bracing himself against a pine-trunk chest, heaving as he forced air into his aching lungs. His hips screamed with each step, an old pain gnawing at the joint like wolves on bone. But he ignored it. The flashlight beam trembled in his shaking hand, slicing across black tree trunks, flickering in and out of the flurries. "Blaze," he shouted into the storm, voice hoarse, nearly drowned out by the shrieking wind. "Blaze, where are you, boy?" No answer. Only the storm roaring back its indifference. He pushed forward again, boots crunching through drifts that reached nearly to his thighs now. Snow soaked through his jeans, icing his legs with every step. The cold gnawed at his bones, numbing his feet until he could no longer feel his toes. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the snow itself was trying to drag him down, swallow him whole. Then, just as he thought his legs would give out beneath him, he heard it. A bark, sharp, piercing, familiar. His head snapped up, adrenaline flooding his veins in a scalding rush. The pain in his hip vanished beneath it. He turned his head, straining to locate the sound. "Blaze," he roared again, voice cracking with desperation. Another bark answered, closer this time, followed by a low, urgent whine. Ethan staggered toward the sound flashlight beam, swinging wildly across the snow-slick forest floor. The darkness pressed in around him, heavy and oppressive, each shadow flickering with imagined threats. He stumbled over a buried root, catching himself hard against a tree. Bark scraped skin from his palms through the torn wool of his gloves. He didn't feel it. All that mattered was the barking. The wind gusted sideways, briefly parting the veil of snow. For a fleeting second, the forest opened before him, and he saw them. Blaze stood tall and tense, Hackle's raised ears pricked forward. His powerful chest heaved with each panting breath, steam rising from his open mouth into the frigid air. His bright amber eyes burned with fierce protectiveness as he stood over a small, huddled figure crumpled beneath a fallen tree. Sophia, her name cut through Ethan's mind like a blade. Even though he didn't yet know who she was, Something primal within him recognized her small, broken, vulnerable. The part of him that was father, protector, rescuer surged to the forefront, drowning out the bitter, calloused cop who'd tried to bury it for years. "Good boy," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Good boy, Blaze." He stumbled forward, snow spraying out from beneath his boots. Each step felt like moving through wet cement, but he forced his legs to obey. As he drew closer, Blaze turned his head slightly, ears flicking back in acknowledgement, but he didn't move from his position guarding the girl. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, vibrating the air around them with primal warning. "It's okay, boy," Ethan murmured as he approached, keeping his voice low and calm. "It's okay. I'm here. I'm here." He dropped to his knees beside the girl, ignoring the way his joints screamed in protest. His flashlight fell to the snow with a muffled thump, casting a trembling circle of yellow light around them. In its glow, he saw her clearly for the first time. She was tiny, thin and frail beneath a puffy pink coat, the hem torn and crusted with ice. Her jeans were soaked through, clinging to legs so thin they looked breakable. Her face was pale, lips cracked, and blue eyes swollen nearly shut from frozen tears. Snow clung to her lashes in crystalline spikes, and her hair was a tangled mat of ice and dirt. But it was her eyes that broke him. They were wide and dark, staring up at him with a vacant terror that reached into the deepest part of his soul and tore it open. She didn't flinch as he reached for her, didn't move at all. Only her chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged gasps, steam rising from her parted lips. "Hey there," he whispered, voice breaking as he cupped her frozen cheek with a shaking hand. His glove felt coarse and rough against her delicate skin. "Hey there, sweetheart. You're okay. You're okay now." Her lips trembled, but no sound came out. Tears pooled in her wide eyes, spilling over to streak down her pale frostbitten cheeks. Her entire body shivered violently, small shoulders jerking with each convulsion. "Easy now," Ethan murmured, slipping his arms beneath her. Her body felt weightless in his grip, as fragile as glass. She whimpered softly as he lifted her against his chest, pressing her face into the thick wool of his sweater. Her tears soaked into the fabric, instantly hot against his ice-cold skin. Blaze pressed closer, massive head bumping against Ethan's shoulder, a low whine vibrating in his chest. His bright eyes flicked back and forth, scanning the darkness beyond, ears pricked forward, alert. Ethan wrapped his arms tighter around the girl, pressing his cheek against her frozen hair. "Good boy," he whispered again, voice cracking with relief. "Good boy, Blaze. You did so good." He shifted, bracing his knee against the frozen ground to push himself to his feet. Pain lanced up his leg, bright and searing, but he gritted his teeth against it. The girl whimpered softly in his arms, small hands clutching weakly at his coat. Her body shivered so violently he could feel her bones rattling against his chest. "It's okay, sweetheart," he murmured into her hair, blinking back the tears that blurred his vision. "I got you now. I got you." Then through the raging scream of the storm, another sound cut through, the sharp metallic click of a gun hammer being pulled back. Ethan froze his breath, catching in his chest. Blaze let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the soles of Ethan's boots. The dog shifted, stepping between Ethan and the darkness behind them, body tense and quivering with protective rage. "Don't move." The voice was ragged, trembling with rage and grief and madness. Ethan turned his head slightly, careful not to jostle the girl in his arms. Snow swirled around them in blinding sheets, but through the flickering light of his dropped flashlight, he saw him. Russell Carter stood 10 yards away, rifle raised, barrel trained directly on Ethan's chest. His face was twisted into a rictus of rage and anguish, tears streaming down his scarred cheek to freeze against his jaw. His breath came in ragged bursts, fogging around his face in the frigid air. "Put her down," he rasped, voice breaking on the last word. "Put her down, or I swear to God I'll blow your fucking head off." Ethan's mind raced, flicking through a lifetime of tactical training and hostage negotiations. His pulse hammered in his throat, the roar of his own blood nearly drowning out the storm. He tightened his grip around the girl, instinctively shielding as much of her as he could with his body. "Easy now," he said softly, his voice low and calm despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. "Easy, friend. No one's gonna hurt you. Just put the gun down and we can talk." Russell's eyes flicked to Sophia, wild and desperate. His hands shook violently on the rifle, the barrel bobbing up and down as his muscles spasmed with emotion. "Emily," he whispered, voice cracking. "Emily, baby, come to Daddy. Come to Daddy now." Sophia whimpered against Ethan's chest, clutching tighter to his coat. Her small body trembled so violently he could feel her teeth chattering against his ribs. Tears soaked through his sweater, burning his skin with their heat. "Her name's not Emily," Ethan said softly. eyes locked on Russell's tear-streaked face. Her name is Sophia. She's not your daughter. You know that. Russell let out a strangled sob, his entire body shaking with grief and fury. His finger twitched on the trigger, the barrel dipping briefly, before rising again to aim directly at Ethan's forehead. "Put her down," he growled, voice guttural and broken. "Put her down." Blaze snarled, a deep rumbling sound that rolled out of his massive chest like thunder. His lips peeled back from his sharp white teeth, ears flattened against his skull. The fur along his spine bristled in a thick, quivering ridge. He shifted forward, paws sinking into the snow body coiled with the promise of violence. "Stay, Blaze," Ethan said softly, his voice low and calm. "Stay." But the dog didn't move. His bright amber eyes burned with protective fury as he glared at the man who threatened his pack. Russell sobbed again. The sound ripped from his chest like tearing cloth. Tears streamed down his scarred cheek, freezing instantly against his skin. His entire body trembled with grief and rage and madness. "Emily," he whispered again, voice breaking. "Emily, please, come to Daddy." Sophia whimpered softly against Ethan's chest, burying her face deeper into his coat. Her small fists clutched at his sweater with desperate strength, her entire body trembling with terror and cold. Ethan tightened his grip around her, shifting slightly to shield as much of her as he could. His eyes never left Russell's, reading the flickering chaos that burned there, the grief, the madness, the desperate hope. The barrel of the rifle dipped for a fraction of a second, trembling violently in Russell's shaking hands. Ethan took a slow, deep breath, steeling himself. Then the hammer clicked back again, and the barrel rose. And in that frozen, breathless moment, with death staring him down through a trembling iron sight, Ethan Walker realized he wasn't afraid. Not for himself, only for the child in his arms. The storm roared around them, tearing through the pines with a furious howl. Snow whipped sideways in blinding sheets, coating Ethan's beard in frost, numbing his skin, until he could no longer feel the tears streaking down his face. But he felt the barrel of the rifle pressed against his forehead, cold and unyielding, vibrating faintly with the tremor in Russell's hands. "Give her to me." Russell's voice was raw, cracked from screaming into the storm, trembling with a grief so deep it burned through his madness like molten iron. Tears streamed down his scarred cheek, freezing instantly into jagged crystals that clung to the ragged edge of his beard. "Give her to me, please," he whispered, his voice dropping to a hoarse whine. "She's mine. She's my Emily. God gave her back to me." Ethan held Sophia tighter against his chest. She was trembling violently, her face buried in the thick wool of his sweater, small fists clutching desperately at his coat. Her silent sobs shook through her entire body, vibrating into his bones with each shuddering breath. "She's not Emily," Ethan said softly, keeping his voice calm despite the adrenaline roaring through his veins. "Her name is Sophia. She's someone's daughter, someone's little girl who's waiting for her to come home." Russell let out a strangled sob, pressing the barrel harder against Ethan's forehead. The metal bit into his skin, cutting through the layer of frost, sending a sharp stab of pain through his skull. "No," Russell screamed, his voice ragged with desperation. "They took her from me. They said she was dead. But I know she isn't. She's here. God gave her back to me." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears, but his voice remained steady. "I know you lost your daughter," he said softly, eyes locked onto Russell's wild, tear-filled gaze. "I know that pain, friend. I lost my wife. I lost my son. I know what it's like to have your family ripped away from you." Russell's eyes flickered, his grip on the rifle twitching slightly. For a moment, Ethan saw the man behind the madness, a broken father hollowed out by grief, clinging desperately to a delusion that kept him breathing. "Don't," Russell whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't talk about her like you know. You don't know her. You don't know what she meant to me." "I know what she meant to you," Ethan said, voice low and calm the way he spoke to feral dogs cornered in traps. "Because I know what my wife meant to me. I know what my son meant to me. I know what it's like to wake up every morning and feel like your heart's been ripped out of your chest." Russell let out a keening sob, shoulders shaking violently. His finger trembled on the trigger, the barrel dipping slightly before rising again. "I just want her back," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I just want her back." Ethan swallowed hard, forcing down the lump of grief that rose in his throat. His arms tightened around Sophia as she whimpered softly against his chest, her small body trembling like a terrified rabbit caught in a snare. "She's not your daughter," Ethan said softly, gently. "Look at her. Really look at her. That's not Emily. You know that." Russell's eyes flickered again, darting down to the small figure cradled in Ethan's arms. For a moment, confusion clouded his gaze, his breathing hitching in his chest. But then madness surged back to the forefront, his face twisting with rage. "No," he roared, pressing the barrel harder against Ethan's forehead. "Don't lie to me. Don't you fucking lie to me. That's my daughter. That's my Emily." Sophia whimpered again, clutching tighter at Ethan's coat. Her tears soaked through the wool, burning his chilled skin with their warmth. Blaze let out a low, rumbling growl, his massive body quivering with tension as he crouched beside Ethan, ears pinned back, eyes locked on Russell with primal fury. "Please, Russell," whispered, his voice breaking into a sob. "Please, Emily. Come to Daddy. Come to Daddy, baby." Sophia didn't move. Her entire body was frozen in terror, her small hands clutching desperately at Ethan's coat, refusing to let go. Russell's face twisted with rage. He stepped forward, jamming the barrel of the rifle against Ethan's temple so hard it knocked his head sideways. "Let go of her!" he screamed, his voice cracking with madness. "Let her go." Ethan's teeth rattled in his skull, pain exploding across his temple from the impact. But he didn't loosen his grip. His eyes locked onto Russell's, seeing the flickering chaos burning there. Grief, rage, hope, despair, all warring beneath the thin surface of sanity. "Don't do this," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling now with emotion. "Please, friend, don't do this." Russell let out a ragged sob, shoulders shaking violently. His finger twitched on the trigger, the barrel dipping for a split second before rising again. Tears streamed down his scarred cheek, dripping onto the stock of the rifle. "I can't lose her again," he whispered, his voice breaking into a sob. I can't. Ethan swallowed hard, his own eyes burning with tears. "I know," he whispered. "I know." For a brief trembling moment, silence fell between them. The storm roared around them, tearing through the trees with a howling fury. But in that small circle of flickering flashlight glow, the world held its breath. Then Russell's face twisted with sudden resolve. His grip tightened on the rifle finger, curling around the trigger. "Stand her up," he rasped, voice low and guttural. "Stand her up and send her to me." Ethan's pulse thundered in his chest. He tightened his grip around Sophia, instinctively pulling her closer against his body. She whimpered softly, her small hands clutching at his coat, refusing to let go. "I can't do that," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "I can't." Russell let out a strangled scream of rage. He stepped forward, jamming the barrel against Ethan's forehead, so hard it sent a bright flash of pain exploding behind his eyes. "Stand her up!" he roared, spit flying from his lips, tears streaming down his face. "Stand her up now!" Sophia let out a broken sob, her small body trembling violently. Blaze snarled beside Ethan, the deep rumbling growl vibrating through the soles of his boots. Ethan swallowed hard, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and grief and rage. His mind raced through options, strategies, tactics. But all he could see was the terrified child in his arms, the rifle barrel pressed against his skull. The madman before him shaking with grief so deep it had consumed him entirely. Slowly trembling, he loosened his grip on Sophia. Her small hands clutched desperately at his coat, her wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto his with silent pleading. "It's okay," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "It's okay, sweetheart. Do as he says," she whimpered softly, tears spilling down her frostbitten cheeks. Her small hands clutched at his coat for another trembling second before she let go, her fingers sliding away from the rough wool. Ethan set her down gently on her feet. Her knees buckled beneath her, nearly sending her crashing into the snow. But she caught herself at the last second, swaying unsteadily. She was so small, so frail. Her entire body trembled violently, her shoulders jerking with each ragged sob. Russell's eyes burned with a wild, desperate light. Tears streamed down his scarred cheek, freezing instantly in the frigid air. His grip on the rifle trembled, the barrel bobbing up and down with each shuddering breath. "Come here, Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking into a sob. "Come to Daddy." Sophia didn't move. Her wide, tear-filled eyes flicked to Ethan, pleading silently. Her small hands trembled at her sides, fingers curling and uncurling in the freezing air. "Please," Russell whispered again, tears dripping onto the rifle stock. "Please, baby. Come to Daddy." Slowly, trembling violently, Sophia took a single shuffling step forward. Her knees buckled with the motion, nearly sending her crashing to the ground, but she caught herself at the last second. Tears streamed down her cheeks, freezing instantly against her pale skin. "That's it," Russell whispered, his voice trembling with grief and hope and madness. "That's it, baby. Come to Daddy." Ethan's entire body shook with adrenaline. His hand drifted slowly to his hip, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the revolver strap there. Blaze crouched beside him, massive body coiled with tension, low growls vibrating in his chest. Russell stepped forward, rifle lowering slightly, as his arms reached out, trembling with desperate hope. "That's it," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "That's it, Emily. Daddy's here. Daddy's here." Sophia whimpered softly, taking another trembling step forward. Her small body swayed unsteadily, knees buckling beneath her thin legs. Ethan's fingers closed around the grip of his revolver, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. His eyes locked onto Russell's trembling face, reading the chaos flickering there. Blaze let out a low, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating through the frozen ground like distant thunder. And in that frozen, breathless moment, the storm roared around them, screaming through the pines with a fury that shook the earth itself. The world narrowed into a trembling tunnel of noise and movement, all else obliterated by the pounding of Ethan's heart in his ears. The storm shrieked around them, ripping through the trees with feral rage. But within that thin circle of flickering flashlight glow, only three beings existed: the broken man with a rifle, the trembling girl he claimed as his salvation, and the old warrior kneeling in the snow with death pressed against his skull. Russell's breath came in ragged gasps, fogging the freezing air with each trembling exhale. His tear-streaked face twisted between hope and rage as he reached for Sophia, his grip shifting on the rifle stock barrel, dipping away from Ethan's temple. "That's it, baby," he crooned, voice cracking with grief and madness. "Come to Daddy. Come home." Sophia took another stumbling step forward. Her knees buckled, her small body swaying like a broken reed in the storm. Her wide eyes darted to Ethan, shimmering with silent pleading. But she kept moving, compelled by the gun and the desperate rage burning in Russell's eyes. Ethan's fingers curled tighter around the grip of his revolver, heart pounding so hard it rattled his ribs. His mind raced through tactical options, flicking through a lifetime of training and field experience. But each plan ended with the same outcome: Sophia dead. The thought turned his stomach to ice. Blaze shifted beside him, massive body tense hackles bristling in a rippling ridge down his spine. His bright amber eyes burned with primal focus as he watched Russell's every trembling movement. A low growl rumbled in his chest, vibrating through the frozen ground and into Ethan's bones. Then, in a single instant that cracked the world open, everything changed. Russell shifted his grip on the rifle, the barrel sweeping past Sophia's shoulder, momentarily pointing at Ethan again. His eyes blazed with a desperate light as he screamed, voice breaking in two, "Emily!" and Blaze moved. He launched forward with explosive power, snow exploding in a shimmering spray beneath his paws. His massive jaws opened wide, teeth flashing bright white in the flickering flashlight beam. Ethan saw the muscles ripple down his shoulders, the pure force of instinct and loyalty and love, propelling him forward in a blur of fur and fury. The rifle barrel swung sideways, just as Blaze's teeth sank into Russell's forearm with a wet, crunching snap. Russell screamed, a raw animal shriek of pain and rage and terror. His finger convulsed on the trigger. The rifle bucked in his grip, muzzle flash exploding in a bright orange bloom that lit up the storm in a frozen, hellish tableau. The gunshot cracked through the night like thunder. Snowflakes scattered in the shockwave, flickering through the orange glow like sparks. The bullet tore through the air, slicing across Ethan's upper arm with a searing burst of pain. Warm blood sprayed across the front of his coat, turning the snow at his knees into a dark, crimson slurry. Sophia screamed. It was a soundless scream ripped from her throat in pure, primal terror. Her mouth opened, wide eyes screwed shut against the flash of gunfire, small hands clapping over her ears in a futile attempt to block out a sound she couldn't hear. Blaze snarled, deep and guttural, shaking his massive head back and forth, his powerful jaws grinding down into Russell's flesh. Blood sprayed across the snow in dark arcs as the man howled, the rifle dropping from his grip to vanish into the drifts. He swung his free hand wildly, slamming his fist down onto Blaze's skull again and again. But the dog didn't flinch, didn't loosen his grip. His amber eyes blazed with feral fury, ears pinned back against his skull body braced wide to absorb the frantic blows. Sophia stumbled backward, knees buckling beneath her as she collapsed into the snow. Tears streamed down her face, freezing instantly against her pale cheeks. Her entire body shook with terror and exhaustion, every ragged sob ripped from her chest like a broken drumbeat. Russell screamed again, high and shrill, his voice cracking into ragged sobs. Let go of me, you demon!" His fist slammed down onto Blaze's muzzle again, splitting the skin across the dog's nose, blood mingling with the snow in dark crimson spatters. Blaze snarled louder, a deep rumbling roar that vibrated through the ground like thunder. His teeth sank deeper into Russell's arm, grinding bone against bone with a sickening crunch. Ethan forced himself to move. Pain burned through his shoulder with every breath, warm blood soaking through his sweater, but he pushed it aside. His hand dropped to the revolver at his hip, fingers closing around the grip with desperate urgency. He drew it smoothly, the motion honed by decades of muscle memory, and brought it up to aim at Russell's chest. But before he could pull the trigger, another movement caught his eye. Sophia, through her tears and terror, through the freezing numbness consuming her limbs, a flicker of something else burned in her eyes: fury, survival, the final spark of a child who refused to die without fighting back. Her small hand closed around a thick branch, half buried in the snow beside her. It was heavy, nearly as long as her arm, gnarled with frozen knots of pine resin. She lifted it with trembling arms, tears streaming down her cheeks, and rose shakily to her knees. Russell was too focused on Blaze to see her. His face twisted in a rictus of pain and rage, spittle flying from his lips as he screamed curses down at the snarling husky latched onto his arm. And Sophia swung. The branch cracked across Russell's temple with a dull, wet thud. His head snapped sideways, blood spraying from a gash that split his eyebrow open to the bone. His eyes rolled back in his skull, knees buckling beneath him as he dropped sideways into the snow with a heavy thump. Blaze released his grip instantly, massive chest heaving with ragged breaths. Blood dripped from his jaws onto the churned snow, steam rising in tiny curls from his heaving sides. His ears pinned back against his skull, lips curled into a deep, guttural snarl as he stood over Russell's motionless body. Bright amber eyes locked onto the fallen man with unwavering fury. Sophia's chest heaved with silent sobs. The branch dropped from her shaking hands, landing in the snow with a muffled thud. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways into the drift body, curling in on itself with exhaustion and shock. Ethan moved forward instantly, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder. He dropped to his knees beside her, cradling her small, trembling form against his chest. Her tears soaked into his coat as she pressed her face into his sweater, tiny fingers clutching desperately at the rough wool. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. You're safe." Blaze stood over them, massive body tense head lowered to hover protectively above Sophia. A low, rumbling growl rolled from his chest as he stared down at Russell's prone form, ears pinned back against his skull. Russell moaned softly, blood pooling beneath his head to stain the snow dark crimson. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and glassy lips trembling with silent words Ethan couldn't hear. Blaze snarled again, louder this time, the sound vibrating through the frozen ground. His teeth-bared lips curling back in a savage warning that left no doubt in Ethan's mind. If Russell moved again, Blaze would finish what he started. Sophia whimpered softly against Ethan's chest, her small body trembling violently. He tightened his grip around her, pressing his cheek against her tangled hair, ignoring the hot sting of tears that burned his eyes. "You're okay," he whispered again, voice ragged with relief and grief and rage. "You're okay. I've got you. I've got you." The storm screamed around them, tearing through the trees with a fury that shook the earth. But within that small circle of flickering light and blood-stained snow, an old man, a broken child, and a loyal warrior stood together, unbreakable. Russell let out a ragged sob, his breath steaming in the frigid air. His eyes rolled back again, lids fluttering closed as his body went limp in the snow. Blaze lowered his massive head, pressing his bloodied muzzle gently against Sophia's shaking shoulder. His warm breath puffed against her frozen skin, grounding her, reminding her she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Ethan swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that blurred his vision. His hand closed around the revolver in his lap, knuckles white with tension. But he didn't raise it. Didn't need to. Blaze had already won this battle, and as the storm howled its furious grief through the darkened pines, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would not die here. Not tonight. Not while Blaze still drew breath. The world pulsed around Ethan in ragged beats of agony and adrenaline. Each thump of his heart sent another scorching burst of pain lancing down his arm, radiating out from the ragged wound in his shoulder, where the bullet had carved a burning path through flesh and muscle. Blood dripped steadily from his fingertips, spattering the churned snow in dark crimson droplets that steamed faintly in the frigid air. He pressed his free hand hard against the wound, gritting his teeth as white-hot pain seared through his chest. The smell of copper filled his nose, mixing with the sharp tang of gunpowder and the wild, earthy musk of Blaze's blood-flecked fur. Sophia clung to him, her small hands fisting into the torn wool of his coat. Her body shook with silent sobs, each trembling gasp rattling her thin shoulders. Tears streamed down her cheeks, freezing instantly against her pale skin. "It's okay, sweetheart," Ethan whispered, his voice ragged with pain. "It's okay. You're gonna be okay." But even as he spoke, he knew time was running out. Russell lay sprawled in the snow a few feet away, his breath rasping in shallow, broken gasps. Blood trickled from the gash Sophia's branch had carved across his temple, staining the snow dark beneath his head. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. But even through the haze of pain and concussion, madness still burned there, flickering behind dilated pupils like wildfire. "Emily," he rasped, voice hoarse and broken. "Emily, come back." Blaze stood between them, massive chest heaving with ragged breaths. Blood dripped from his jaws, staining the pristine snow at his feet. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a low, rumbling snarl that vibrated through the frozen ground. His bright amber eyes burned with feral fury as he watched Russell's trembling hands muscles coiled with the promise of violence. Ethan tightened his grip on Sophia's thin shoulders, forcing his eyes to focus through the pulsing haze of pain. "Sophia," he said, his voice low but sharp with command. Her wide, tear-filled eyes flicked up to meet his, shimmering with terror and confusion. "Listen to me. You need to run." She shook her head violently, tears flying from her lashes to scatter in the swirling snow. Her small hands clutched tighter at his coat, her silent sobs breaking his heart with each ragged tremor. "Sweetheart," he said again, his voice cracking with desperation. "Look at me." Her eyes locked onto his, wide and dark, and filled with a terror so deep it reached into his soul and tore it open. Blood dripped steadily down his arm to patter onto her coat in dark spreading blossoms. "You need to run," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Run toward my flashlight. Do you see it over there?" He nodded toward the trembling beam that lay half buried in the snow, casting a weak yellow glow across the churned clearing. The light flickered and pulsed as the battery faltered, but it was still bright enough to guide her. Sophia's gaze darted toward it, then back to him. Her tears spilled faster now, freezing against her cheeks in glistening tracks. "I can't," she mouthed, her cracked lips forming the words silently. "I can't leave you." Pain and pride twisted together in Ethan's chest, tightening around his heart until he thought it might break. "You have to," he said softly, blinking back the tears that burned his eyes. "You have to, sweetheart. I need you to be brave. Can you do that for me? Can you be brave just a little longer?" Her small shoulders shook with silent sobs, but she nodded once, her chin trembling. Ethan swallowed hard, forcing down the lump of grief and rage and pain that rose in his throat. He shifted his gaze to Blaze, who stood quivering with rage and focus ears pinned back against his skull. "Blaze," he rasped, his voice cracking. The dog's ears flicked forward instantly, bright eyes snapping to meet his. "Protect her." Blaze let out a low, rumbling growl, a deep vibration that rolled through his massive chest like distant thunder. His tail stiffened, his muscles rippling beneath his thick, blood-flecked fur as he shifted his weight forward, massive paws sinking into the snow. Sophia whimpered softly, her fingers trembling against Ethan's coat. He bent forward, pressing his forehead against hers, ignoring the searing pain that ripped through his shoulder with the motion. "Run," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Run, Sophia. Run." Then he let her go. For a single frozen moment, she stayed there, her small body trembling with fear and grief. Tears spilled down her cheeks to freeze against her collar. Then she turned, stumbling through the deep drifts toward the flickering beam of the flashlight. Blaze moved with her massive body bristling as he circled around her in wide protective arcs. His growls rolled through the clearing, vibrating through the frozen ground with each rumbling warning. His bright eyes flicked back and forth, locked onto Russell's trembling form as the man stirred in the snow. Russell groaned softly, his head rolling sideways as his glassy eyes fluttered open. Blood streamed from the gash across his temple, staining the snow dark beneath his cheek. His cracked lips parted, forming broken, silent words. "Emily," he rasped, his voice ragged with grief. "Emily, don't go." Blaze snarled, a savage, guttural sound that rolled out of his chest like an approaching avalanche. His massive head lowered, lips peeling back from gleaming white teeth as he bared them in a feral grin. Russell flinched, his trembling hands rising to shield his face from the massive dog looming above him. His breath came in ragged, hitching sobs as he rolled onto his side, trying to push himself upright. "Please," he whispered, voice breaking. "Please, don't take her." Blaze snapped his jaws an inch from Russell's hand, the powerful bite cracking through the air with a bone-deep finality. Russell screamed, jerking his hand back as he tumbled sideways into the snow. The rifle lay half buried a few feet away, but his glazed eyes couldn't focus on it. All he saw was the snarling fury of the massive husky standing over him, eyes burning bright with unbreakable purpose. Sophia stumbled toward the flashlight, her thin legs trembling beneath her with each step. Tears blurred her vision, the swirling snow reducing everything to a shifting haze of white and gray. Her chest heaved with silent sobs, each trembling gasp rattling her ribs until she thought they might crack apart. She collapsed, once her knees buckling, as she fell face first into the snow. For a moment she lay there, her small body shaking with exhaustion and grief. The world blurred around her, darkness creeping in from the edges of her vision as her pulse slowed to a trembling crawl. Then Blaze barked. The sound cracked through the howling wind, like a gunshot, sharp and commanding, and filled with raw, furious life. His massive paws thudded against the ground as he circled around her body, tense and quivering with protective rage. Sophia forced her eyes open. Her chest burned with each ragged gasp, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and cold. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she pushed herself up onto her knees, her small hands digging into the snow. "Run!" Ethan rasped from behind her, his voice hoarse and shaking with pain. "Run, sweetheart. Don't stop. Don't ever stop." She staggered forward again, each step a monumental effort that sent tremors rippling through her thin legs. Blaze moved with her, his massive body shielding her from the screaming wind, ears pricked forward, bright eyes scanning the darkness for threats. Behind them, Russell let out a ragged sob, his body slumping sideways into the snow. Blood trickled from the gash across his temple, freezing instantly against his skin. His cracked lips trembled with silent words as he reached out a trembling hand toward Sophia's retreating form. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Emily, come back. Please, come back." Blaze snarled a deep, rumbling growl that rolled through the clearing like thunder. His bright eyes burned with savage fury as he stepped forward, massive paws crushing the snow beneath him. He lowered his massive head, teeth bared in a feral grin that promised violence beyond comprehension. Russell whimpered softly, tears spilling down his scarred cheeks to freeze against his beard. His hand dropped into the snow, his body slumping sideways as he began to sob, shoulders shaking with broken grief. Blaze barked once sharply, the sound vibrating through the frozen ground with bone-deep finality. Then he turned, massive body moving to press against Sophia's side, guiding her forward with gentle urgency. Ethan watched them go, his vision blurring as pain and relief and grief roared through his veins in molten waves. Blood dripped steadily from his wounds, staining the snow at his knees in widening pools of dark crimson. But he didn't care. They were alive, and as long as Blaze still drew breath, they would remain that way. The darkness trembled with flashes of red and blue that cut through the storm like lightning bolts. Snow whipped sideways in glittering flurries, scattering the light into a kaleidoscope of chaos. The shriek of sirens rose and fell against the screaming wind, echoing off the skeletal pines until it sounded like wailing ghosts drifting through the night. Sophia stumbled forward, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stay upright. Her knees buckled with each step, sending shocks of pain shooting up her thighs into her hips. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Blaze pressed close against her side, his massive body a living wall of heat and muscle guiding her forward with gentle nudges of his broad head. Tears streamed down her cheeks, freezing instantly against her skin. Her chest burned with each ragged, silent sob that tore through her body. Every breath was a struggle, the cold air slicing down her throat like broken glass, but she forced her feet to keep moving. Toward the lights, toward salvation. Behind her, Russell Carter lay sprawled in the churned snow, his blood spreading in a dark halo around his head. His eyes fluttered open and closed, unfocused, and glassy lips trembling with silent words. Tears streaked down his scarred cheek to mix with the blood frozen against his beard. "Emily," he rasped, his voice so faint it was nearly swallowed by the wind. "Emily, don't go. Don't leave Daddy." Blaze snarled, the deep guttural rumble vibrating through Sophia's bones. He turned his massive head toward Russell, lips peeling back from his teeth in a feral grin, ears pinned flat against his skull. Russell whimpered softly, curling in on himself as he pressed his trembling hands to his bleeding head. Then the lights came. Blinding beams of white stabbed through the swirling darkness, sweeping back and forth across the churned clearing. The roar of engines shattered the storm's rhythm, gravel crunching beneath thick winter tires as two patrol trucks skidded to a halt at the edge of the tree line. Doors slammed open. Voices barked commands that cut through the night with military precision. "Move, move. Secure the perimeter. 2 victims, 1 suspect, we need medics now." Figures in heavy tactical coats and snow-dusted hats surged into the clearing, boots crunching through the blood-stained drifts. Their breath steamed in the frigid air, radios crackling with overlapping voices as they fanned out in a coordinated sweep. Blaze let out a single sharp bark tail, flicking once against Sophia's hip before he stepped protectively in front of her massive chest, rumbling with a low growl. His bright amber eyes burned with unbreakable focus as the uniformed shapes approached. "It's okay, big guy," one of them said softly, lowering his rifle to his side as he stepped closer. His voice was calm, controlled, the kind of voice Sophia had only ever heard in doctors' offices or in the memory of her mother's soft lullabies. "Easy now. You're okay. You're both okay? Sophia's knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed into the snow with a choked sob, her thin body curling in on itself as violent shivers racked her shoulders. Blaze instantly pressed his massive body against her side, lowering his head to nuzzle her cheek with a soft whine. His fur was warm against her frozen skin, grounding her, tethering her to the world through the storm of grief and terror raging in her chest. "Medic," the officer barked, turning his head toward the trucks. "We need blankets and thermal packs here now." Two paramedics sprinted forward, their heavy boots throwing up sprays of snow with each step. One knelt beside Sophia, unzipping a thick red bag with trembling hands. The other moved swiftly toward Russell's limp form, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck with clinical precision. "He's got a pulse," the medic said over his shoulder, voice flat and professional. "Weak but steady." "Cuff him," the officer ordered. Another deputy moved forward, pulling a set of black metal cuffs from his belt. Russell whimpered softly as cold steel bit into his wrists, his glassy eyes rolling sideways to stare into the swirling darkness. "Emily," he whispered, tears sliding down his blood-streaked face. "Daddy loves you. Daddy loves you so much." Sophia buried her face in Blaze's thick fur, silent sobs, racking her small frame. Her thin fingers curled into his ruff, clutching desperately, as if letting go would send her drifting into the storm forever. Blaze whined softly, pressing his muzzle against her cheek in a gentle nuzzle. His warm breath fogged against her frozen skin, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt safe. "Easy there, sweetheart," the medic murmured, wrapping a thick thermal blanket around her shaking shoulders. The material crinkled as it settled against her coat, reflecting her body heat back into her trembling bones. "You're safe now. We've got you." Another paramedic moved swiftly through the snow, skidding to a halt beside Ethan's slumped form. Blood stained the snow around him, in dark steaming pools, soaking into his coat and jeans, until it looked as though he'd been dipped in crimson paint. His face was ashen, eyes half closed beneath heavy lids. Each ragged breath rattled in his chest with a wet, gurgling hitch. "Gunshot wound to the shoulder," the medic said quickly, his gloved hands pressing down hard on the torn fabric. Ethan let out a strangled groan, his back arching as pain flared through his chest. "We need a litter here now." 2 deputies sprinted forward with a collapsible stretcher, snapping it open with practiced efficiency. Snow sprayed out in wide arcs as they knelt beside Ethan, their breath steaming in short, sharp bursts. The medic pressed a gauze pad hard against the wound, his blue eyes flicking up to meet Ethan's with calm confidence. "Stay with me, sir," he said firmly. "Can you hear me? Stay with me." Ethan's eyes fluttered open. The world swam around him in a trembling haze of flashing lights and swirling snow, each shape flickering in and out of focus. Pain throbbed through his chest in molten waves radiating out from the bullet wound until every nerve burned with white-hot agony. But through the flickering chaos he saw her. Sophia sat curled beneath Blaze's massive chest, wrapped in a silver thermal blanket. Tears streamed down her cheeks, glistening in the flashing lights as she buried her face in the dog's fur. Blaze stood over her with his head lowered, ears flicking back and forth as he watched the deputies with bright, watchful eyes. Relief surged through Ethan's chest, sharp and painful, catching in his throat like a sob. Tears blurred his vision as he let out a ragged, broken laugh. "She's safe," he whispered, his voice trembling with pain and grief, and something bright and clean that felt almost like hope. "She's safe." "Yeah," the medic said softly, pressing down harder on the wound as blood welled between his fingers. "Yeah, she is. Thanks to you." Another paramedic moved in with a thick padded litter, laying it carefully in the snow beside Ethan's slumped form. The 2 men worked together with brisk efficiency, sliding their arms beneath his shoulders and knees to lift him gently onto the stretcher. Pain ripped through his chest with the motion bright and searing, drawing a strangled groan from his lips. "Easy there, sir," the medic murmured, adjusting the gauze with quick, practiced hands. "We've got you. You're gonna be okay." Ethan blinked up at him, tears streaming down his frostbitten cheeks. The swirling lights overhead flickered and pulsed, dancing in shimmering arcs across the storm-darkened sky. "Blaze," he rasped, his voice cracking with emotion. "Don't leave. Blaze." "We've got him too," the medic said firmly, nodding toward the massive husky standing beside Sophia. "He's not going anywhere." Deputies swarmed around them, securing the clearing with practiced efficiency. One officer knelt beside Russell, checking his cuffs before nodding sharply to his partner. "Get him in the truck," he ordered. "We'll process him at county once he's stable." Russell let out a broken sob, his head rolling sideways as tears streamed down his blood-smeared face. "Emily," he whispered, his voice cracking with grief. "Emily, I'm sorry. Daddy's so sorry." 2 deputies lifted him roughly to his feet, dragging his limp form toward the patrol truck parked at the edge of the clearing. His boots scraped across the churned snow, leaving wide, blood-stained tracks in their wake. Sophia whimpered softly, curling tighter beneath Blaze's massive chest. Her silent sobs shook through her thin frame, each trembling breath rattling in the darkness. Blaze lowered his massive head, pressing his muzzle gently against her cheek in a soft nuzzle. His warm breath fogged against her frozen skin, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt safe. Deputies moved around them in swift, coordinated motions, voices crackling over radios as they relayed status reports and requests for additional units. The storm howled through the trees, scattering snow in swirling flurries that caught the flashing lights and turned them into dancing constellations in the darkness. Sophia closed her eyes, burying her face deeper into Blaze's thick fur. Tears slid down her cheeks, warm against the frozen air as the pounding of her heart slowed from terror to something calmer, something that felt almost like peace. And in that flickering darkness, surrounded by flashing lights and drifting snow, she felt a single silent truth settle into her bones. She was safe. Finally, impossibly, she was safe. The inside of the ambulance was awash with dim, golden light, a soft glow meant to calm patients. But for Sophia, it felt like a spotlight burning into her skull. She sat curled against the padded bench seat, knees drawn tight to her chest beneath the thermal blanket. Her thin shoulders shook with silent tremors that rattled her small frame, her breathing coming in short, sharp gasps. The world was blurred around her, flickering in and out of focus as tears pooled in her wide, unblinking eyes. Each ragged breath burned her throat, the recycled air of the ambulance thick with antiseptic and the faint coppery tang of blood. She couldn't stop shaking. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, Russell, looming over her, with wild, tear-filled eyes, his cracked lips trembling as he whispered her stolen name. Emily. The word echoed through her skull like a curse bouncing off the walls of her mind until she thought she might go mad from it. Easy there, sweetheart, the paramedic murmured from across the bench. She was a broad-shouldered woman, with deep lines carved into her dark skin, her thick hair pulled back into a tight braid. Her voice was calm, low and warm as she spoke, but Sophia didn't hear the words. She only saw the jacket. It was dark, deep navy blue, almost black in the dim light. The shoulders were wide, and for a single frozen moment, her mind twisted the image into something else. Something monstrous. Something that had ripped her from the world she knew and dragged her down into a pit of darkness and grief. A strangled whimper tore from her throat. Her body lurched sideways, curling tighter against the padded wall. Her fingers clawed at the thermal blanket, pulling it up over her face, until only her wide, tear-filled eyes peeked out from beneath the edge. The paramedic froze. Syringe paused halfway to the IV line, taped to Sophia's thin arm. Her dark eyes softened with understanding, and she lowered the needle slowly, placing it gently back into the tray beside her knee. "Hey," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to crack. "Hey, baby girl. It's okay. You're safe now. No one's gonna hurt you here." Sophia didn't move. Her chest heaved with each trembling gasp, her eyes locked on the dark jacket, seeing only Russell. Seeing only the madness burning behind his wide, tear-filled eyes. "Emily," he whispered in her memory, his cracked lips splitting in a trembling smile. "Come to Daddy, baby. Come home." Her body jerked violently as a sob tore free, ripped from her chest like a wound. Tears streamed down her cheeks to soak the thermal blanket clutched against her mouth. Her shoulders shook with silent grief as the world blurred and spun around her. Across the narrow aisle, Ethan lay strapped to a gurney, his body limp beneath the thick wool blanket covering his chest. An oxygen mask was strapped tightly across his face, misting with each ragged, rattling breath. Blood had soaked through the bandages wrapped around his upper arm, staining the fabric a deep, spreading crimson. His skin was ashen, lips tinged faintly blue beneath his thick gray beard. But even in unconsciousness, his hand didn't let go of the leash. The thick leather strap was wrapped twice around his trembling fingers, the metal clasp dangling slack against his wrist. Blood spattered across his knuckles, dried in dark streaks beneath his cracked nails. The leash led down to the ambulance floor, where Blaze sat pressed tight against the side of the gurney. The massive husky sat motionless, his thick fur matted with blood and ice ears drooping slightly against his broad skull. His bright amber eyes were dulled with exhaustion and grief as he rested his massive head against the edge of the stretcher, long whiskers brushing against Ethan's pale, unmoving hand. He let out a low, trembling whine, the sound vibrating through the floor of the ambulance like distant thunder. His nose twitched as he sniffed at the blood-soaked bandages wrapped around Ethan's shoulder, a deep rumble vibrating in his chest as he pressed closer against the gurney. The paramedic turned her gaze to him, her lips pressing into a thin, trembling line. She reached out slowly, fingers brushing against the thick ruff of fur around his neck. Blaze flinched away from her touch, a low growl rumbling in his throat as his ears flattened against his skull. "Easy, big guy," she murmured, her voice trembling just enough to crack. "He's okay. We're going to take care of him. You did good. You did so good." Blaze didn't move. His bright eyes flicked up to meet hers for a single trembling moment, and in their amber depths she saw it, the grief, the rage, the unbreakable loyalty that burned beneath every primal instinct and drove him forward through blood and pain and snow. Then he lowered his head again, pressing his massive muzzle against Ethan's unmoving hand with a soft, trembling whine. Sophia watched him through the trembling blur of her tears. Her chest burned with each ragged breath, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, the darkness flickered and shifted in her mind, and she saw Blaze not as a dog, but as a knight, his silver and gray armor stained with blood, as he stood guard over the fallen king. The thought made a broken, strangled sound slip from her lips, half sob, half laugh, so sharp it cut her throat raw. The paramedic flinched, her dark eyes flicking up to meet Sophia's wide, tear-filled gaze. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached out slowly, gently, her fingers brushing against Sophia's trembling hand, where it clutched the thermal blanket. "You're okay now," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I promise. You're safe. He can't hurt you anymore." But Sophia didn't hear her. She only saw the dark jacket, the broad shoulders, the cracked smile and tear-streaked face whispering Emily into the darkness. Her body jerked again with a sob, her thin fingers clawing deeper into the blanket as she pressed it tighter against her mouth. Blaze lifted his head slightly, ears flicking forward at the sound of her sobs. His bright eyes locked onto her trembling form, and for a single shattering moment, the grief and exhaustion burning in his gaze softened. He let out a low, rumbling whine, a soft sound that rolled through the ambulance like a lullaby. His massive head lowered again, pressing gently against Ethan's limp hand, but his eyes stayed locked on Sophia, watching her with silent, unbreakable promise. "I'm here," they seemed to say. "You're not alone." Sophia's sobs slowed to trembling hiccups as she stared back at him through the blur of her tears. The ambulance rattled around them, tires crunching through the snow sirens, wailing into the darkness beyond. The world flickered and blurred around her, each flashing light splintering into shards of memory that cut through her mind until she thought she might bleed from them. But Blaze didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look away. He just watched her with those bright, burning eyes, his massive chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythms as he pressed his muzzle closer against Ethan's limp hand. And in that flickering darkness, with grief and terror swirling through her chest like a hurricane, Sophia felt a single trembling truth settle into her bones. She wasn't alone, not as long as he was here, not as long as Blaze still breathed. The first thing Ethan felt was the light. It pressed against his closed eyelids in gentle warmth. Not the biting glare of halogen floodlights at crime scenes. Not the flickering orange of campfires in the snowbound dark. This light was softer tinged with gold, carrying with it the faint scent of sun-warmed sheets and antiseptic. He let out a low, ragged groan. The world shifted around him, in blurred motion, bright shapes swimming behind his closed eyes. For a long moment, he didn't try to move. Each breath sent sharp stabs of pain radiating through his chest and down his arm, blooming outward in molten waves that blurred the edges of his consciousness. But the warmth drew him back, pulled him up through the dark waters of pain and grief up toward the surface where life waited. He blinked. The ceiling above him was white, textured with faint swirls of plaster and lit by late afternoon sunlight, slanting through half-open blinds. Dust motes floated lazily in the golden beams, drifting like tiny planets in a silent universe. The smell of antiseptic burned faintly in his nose, mingled with the sharp sting of rubbing alcohol and the cleaner scent of freshly laundered blankets. A hospital. Memories surged through him in flashes. Russell's cracked voice screaming Emily into the storm. The roar of the rifle. The burning pain as the bullet tore through his shoulder. Sophia's wide, terrified eyes. Blaze's savage snarl as he lunged forward, teeth sinking deep into Russell's arm. And then darkness, thick and suffocating, swallowing him whole. He tried to sit up. Pain flared through his shoulder like lightning, tearing a strangled groan from his throat. The movement set off a flurry of beeps from the monitor beside his bed, and almost instantly, a nurse bustled into the room. "Easy there, Mr. Walker," she said briskly, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun that accentuated the deep lines of fatigue beneath her eyes. "You took quite a hit. Don't go trying to sit up until the doctor clears you." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry and raw. "Blaze." He rasped the word, cracking in his mouth like old timber. "Where's Blaze?" The nurse paused, softening for a brief moment. "Your dog is fine," she said, gently adjusting his IV with deft fingers. "Animal control wanted to take him, but the sheriff intervened. "He's down in the therapy courtyard. They've been letting him visit you for short periods, but he wore himself out guarding your door all night." Ethan closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his temple into the pillow. Relief cut through him so sharply it almost hurt. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled softly. "I'll tell the family waiting outside that you're awake." He frowned faintly. Family. But she had already turned away, slipping out into the bright hallway beyond. For a few heartbeats, the only sound in the room was the slow, steady beep of the cardiac monitor and the faint hiss of warm air cycling through the overhead vent. Ethan let his gaze drift to the window, watching dust motes swirl through the golden light. Each flickering speck moved with silent grace, unconcerned with pain or grief or redemption. Then the door creaked open. Soft footsteps padded across the linoleum floor. A small shadow flickered across his chest, then paused beside the bed. Ethan turned his head slowly, his neck stiff with bruised muscle and pain. Sophia stood there, half hidden behind her mother's legs. Her thin hands clutched a folded sheet of white paper against her chest, the edges crumpled from nervous fingers. Her hair had been brushed out into soft waves that framed her small pale face, and her cheeks were flushed pink with shy excitement. Dark bruises still shadowed the delicate skin beneath her eyes, but their wide, dark depths were clear-focused alive. Behind her stood her parents, their eyes red with tears and exhaustion. Her mother clutched her shoulders gently, fingers trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from Sophia's forehead. Her father's broad hand rested on her other shoulder, squeezing softly. Sophia stepped forward, her boots scuffing quietly against the tile. The folded paper trembled in her grip as she held it out toward him. Ethan blinked, tears blurring his vision as he reached out with his good hand. His fingers closed around the paper, feeling the deep press of colored pencil lines beneath the thin fibers. He unfolded it slowly. It was a drawing sketched in thick, bright crayon strokes. 3 figures stood beneath a wide blue sky, streaked with yellow sunbeams. The first was a small girl with dark hair and a red scarf, her arms thrown wide in joy. Beside her was a massive husky drawn with thick gray and white lines, his eyes 2 bright orange circles of fierce loyalty. And standing beside them, tall and broad with a gray beard and kind blue eyes, was Ethan. Above them, looping across the sky in wobbly pink letters, was a single sentence: "Thank you for saving me." Tears spilled down Ethan's cheeks, soaking into his beard as his chest heaved with silent sobs. His hand trembled as he traced the crayon lines, his fingertip brushing gently over the small figure of Sophia, over the broad-shouldered man beside her, over the dog whose tail curved up in proud happiness. Sophia stepped closer, her small hand curling around his thumb where it lay on the blanket. Her grip was trembling, but her eyes burned with a quiet, unbreakable strength as she looked up at him. "Mr. Walker?" She whispered, her voice so soft and raspy, it was almost lost beneath the hum of the machines. You're my hero." Ethan's throat tightened so hard it hurt. He swallowed against the lump, blinking back the tears that blurred her face into a trembling watercolor of light and shadow. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, sweetheart. You're the hero. You and Blaze." At the sound of his name, there was a sudden scrabble of claws against tile outside the door. Then a muffled bark. The door swung open, and Blaze bounded into the room with a low, whining woof that vibrated through the floor. His thick fur was freshly brushed, his bright amber eyes glowing with relief as he loped to the bedside, pressing his massive head against Ethan's chest with a soft, rumbling whine. Ethan buried his fingers in the thick ruff of fur around Blaze's neck, tears streaming down his cheeks as he pressed his forehead against the dog's broad skull. "Hey, old man," he whispered, his voice shaking with grief and relief, and something brighter, something cleaner that burned through his chest with scalding warmth. "Hey there. You did good. You did so damn good." Blaze let out a low, trembling whine, his bright eyes flicking up to meet Sophia's for a single shattering moment. Then he pressed closer against Ethan's side, his massive body trembling with exhausted relief. Sophia stepped closer, her small fingers brushing against Blaze's thick fur. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she knelt beside the bed, burying her face against the husky's shoulder. Blaze turned his head slightly, licking her cheek with a soft, gentle swipe of his broad tongue. Her mother sobbed softly behind her, pressing trembling fingers to her lips. Her father's broad shoulders shook as he wrapped an arm around his wife's waist, pulling her tight against his chest. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The room was silent, but for the steady beep of the heart monitor, the soft hum of the vent, and the slow, trembling breaths of a girl, a dog, and an old man who had once believed he had nothing left to give. But in that silence, something shifted. Something deep and unseen that settled into the bones of the world, reshaping it with trembling hands. "Healing?" Sophia raised her head, tears shimmering in her dark eyes as she looked up at Ethan. "You're my hero," she whispered again, her voice shaking with grief and hope and something so bright it nearly blinded him. "You and Blaze, you saved me." "Who?" Ethan closed his eyes, tears spilling down his cheeks as he tightened his grip on Blaze's thick fur. His chest heaved with silent sobs, each ragged breath tearing away another layer of grief, leaving only the raw, trembling truth beneath. He was needed, he was loved, he was alive, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ethan Walker let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The hospital corridor was quiet, lit by the warm gold of late afternoon sun slanting through tall windows. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of light, drifting in the still air like silent dancers. The faint beeping of distant monitors and the low murmur of nurses behind glass doors blended into a peaceful hum, wrapping the hall in soft stillness. Ethan sat propped up in his hospital bed, staring out at the fading sky. Beyond the window, the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, their dark silhouettes rustling against the dying light. The world felt muted, wrapped in cotton wool and shadow, each shape blurred around the edges by exhaustion and morphine haze. His shoulder burned with each breath, the wound hidden beneath layers of gauze and tape. Every small movement sent tremors of pain radiating down his arm, pulsing deep into the bone. But he welcomed the pain. It reminded him he was alive. It reminded him he'd chosen to be alive. A low rumbling sigh drifted up from the floor beside him. Blaze lay curled at his side, massive head resting on Ethan's thin thigh. His eyes were half-closed lids, flickering as dreams rolled through his tired mind. His ears twitched with each distant noise, rolling carts, quiet footsteps, the rattle of rain against the windows. Every so often he would shift, pressing closer against Ethan's side with a low, contented grunt. Ethan lifted his good hand fingers, brushing gently through Blaze's thick fur. The coarse hair was warm beneath his palm, aligned with the faint hum of muscle and breath. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes, blurring the dark shape of the husky into a trembling shadow of loyalty and love. He didn't hear the door open, but he felt the shift in the room as Sophia's father stepped inside. The man moved quietly, pausing just beyond the end of the bed. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, dark hair curling slightly at his temples where gray had begun to creep in. His eyes were tired, shadowed with grief and relief, and something softer, something brighter that flickered behind the exhaustion. "Mr. Walker," he said softly. Ethan blinked, pulling his gaze away from the darkening window. The man stepped forward, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his heavy winter coat. For a moment, he didn't speak, his eyes drifting down to Blaze, then back up to Ethan's lined, weathered face. He cleared his throat, voice rough with unspoken emotion. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. For Sophia. For all of us." Ethan shook his head slowly, pain flickering across his brow with the motion. "Don't thank me," he rasped, his voice raw from disuse. "Thank her. She's the strong one." The man let out a trembling laugh, a sound halfway between relief and grief. Tears glimmered in his dark eyes as he nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "She is," he whispered. "She really is." Silence fell between them, broken only by the steady hum of the heater and the distant rhythm of monitors down the hall. The man shifted slightly, pulling his hands from his pockets. In one calloused palm, he held a small, folded envelope. He cleared his throat again, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "My wife and I, we were wondering if, when you're feeling up to it, maybe you'd like to come have dinner with us, at our place." Ethan stared at him, blinking slowly as the words sank through the fog of pain and morphine. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The man shifted again, the silence stretching between them like taut wire. "Sophia talks about you all the time," he continued softly, voice trembling. "About you and Blaze. She sleeps with that drawing under her pillow. Says it keeps the bad dreams away. Says you're her hero." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening until it hurt. Tears blurred his vision, shimmering in the dim golden light until the world became a trembling watercolor of shadow and flame. His fingers curled tighter into Blaze's thick fur, the coarse hair grounding him, tethering him to the moment before it slipped away into memory. "I'm no hero," he whispered, his voice cracking. The man stepped forward, laying a trembling hand on Ethan's uninjured shoulder. His grip was strong, calloused, warm. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet hum of the heater filled the silence between them, wrapping the room in gentle warmth. "She doesn't care about heroes," the man said softly, his voice thick with tears. "She cares about you." Blaze lifted his head slightly. bright amber eyes flicking between the two men. His ears perked forward, tail thumping once against the linoleum floor in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Ethan let out a ragged breath that trembled with grief and relief. And something else, something bright and painful and clean. Tears spilled down his cheeks, carving silent rivers through the deep lines of his weathered face. His chest heaved with silent sobs as he turned his gaze down to Blaze. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice breaking. His trembling fingers reached forward, scratching gently behind Blaze's broad ears. The massive husky closed his eyes, leaning into the touch with a low, rumbling sigh of pure contentment. The man stepped back slightly, his own eyes shimmering with tears as he watched them. For a moment, the only sound in the room was Ethan's ragged breathing and the soft sigh of Blaze pressing closer against his side. Then Ethan smiled. It was small at first, barely more than a trembling curve at the corner of his cracked lips. But it grew, spreading slowly across his lined, weathered face until it reached his eyes, lighting them from within with a soft golden glow that hadn't burned there in years. His chest heaved with another silent sob, and tears slipped down his cheeks to soak into Blaze's thick fur. But the smile stayed trembling and broken and whole all at once. For the first time in years spent drowning in silence and grief and old ghosts, Ethan Walker smiled. And in that small, silent hospital room beneath the fading light of a winter sunset, something shifted in the bones of the world, something deep and unseen that settled into the cracks of his grief and began with trembling hands to stitch them closed. Healing, connection, family. The man smiled softly, brushing a trembling hand across his cheek as he turned toward the door. "I'll tell Sophia you said yes," he said, his voice shaking with quiet relief. Ethan didn't speak. Couldn't. He just nodded once, tears streaming down his cheeks as he scratched gently behind Blaze's ears. The dog pressed closer, rumbling softly in his chest as his bright eyes flicked up to meet Ethan's with silent, unbreakable love. Outside the window, the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in trembling shades of purple and gold. The trees swayed gently in the winter breeze, their dark branches dancing against the fading light. And for the first time in a lifetime, Ethan Walker felt the warmth of hope settle deep into his bones. He wasn't alone, not anymore. The winter sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the Oregon forest draped in a deepening indigo twilight. Shadows stretched long between the towering pines, their snow-laden branches sagging in silent reverence as dusk settled over the clearing. Ethan sat on the rough wooden steps of his cabin, bundled in a thick wool sweater and fleece-lined flannel. The cut on his shoulder still ached with each breath, a dull, constant throb that reminded him he was alive. That pain had become his companion these last weeks of recovery, grounding him to the present whenever old memories tried to drag him back under. Blaze lay sprawled beside him, massive frame pressed close against Ethan's leg for warmth. His breathing came in deep, rattling sighs that stirred small puffs of fog into the frigid air. Each exhale carried with it the faint whistle of age. He was 12 now, bones stiff with winter's past, muzzle streaked silver and white. But his eyes burned as brightly as ever, deep amber and fierce, glowing in the pale light like twin coals of loyal fire. Ethan lifted a trembling hand, fingers burying themselves in the thick ruff of Blaze's neck. The husky's ears flicked back slightly at the touch, and he let out a low, contented whine, pressing closer until his weight threatened to topple Ethan sideways on the step. "Easy there, old man," Ethan murmured, his voice rasped from cold and quiet. "I'm still healing, remember?" Blaze huffed softly, the faintest flicker of amusement in his golden gaze. His massive tail thumped once against the snow-dusted step, scattering a small spray of frozen flakes across Ethan's boots. For a long, silent moment, they sat together, watching as the darkness deepened across the clearing. The tall pines rose like black cathedral spires into the twilight sky, branches etched in silver against the gathering stars. A faint breeze drifted through the clearing, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of pine sap and ice and distant wood smoke from unseen chimneys. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing deep of the winter air. Each inhale burned his lungs with cold, tinged with the faint sweetness of coming snow. For the first time in years, he felt that breath settle in his chest without pain, without regret. Footsteps crunched lightly over the packed snow at the edge of the clearing. Blaze lifted his head, ears pricking forward, nose twitching as he caught the familiar scent. A low, soft whine rumbled in his chest, vibrating against Ethan's thigh. Ethan opened his eyes to see Sophia's father approaching up the narrow trail, his broad shoulders bundled beneath a thick down coat. One gloved hand gripped a woven basket covered in a red-checked cloth. The other rested protectively on Sophia's small shoulder as she walked beside him. She was bundled in a puffy blue parka and knit hat, a wool scarf wrapped around her neck so high it brushed her pink cheeks. Stray strands of her dark hair curled out beneath the hat, and her wide dark eyes glimmered with shy excitement as she climbed the steps toward Ethan. Behind them walked Sophia's mother. Cheeks flushed from the cold, a Tupperware container cradled against her chest. Steam rose from the cracks in the lid, curling into the frosty air with the sweet spiced scent of cinnamon and baked apple. Mr. Walker, Sophia's father said, dipping his chin in a polite nod. His eyes flicked to Ethan's shoulder concern, shadowing their dark depths. How are you feeling today? Ethan shifted slightly on the step, wincing as pain lanced through his arm. Better, he rasped, a faint smile flickering at the corner of his lips. Stiff as hell, but better. Sophia's mother stepped forward, her gaze softening as she set the Tupperware gently on the step beside Ethan. We brought you dinner, she said softly. Homemade chicken pot pie and, well. She lifted the basket in her husband's hand, peeling back the red-checked cloth to reveal a golden-crusted apple pie, still steaming from the oven. The sweet, warm aroma drifted into the frozen evening air, curling around Ethan like a memory of holidays long past. Sophia stepped forward, her small boots crunching lightly against the packed snow. Her gloved fingers fumbled with the zipper of her coat pocket, and after a moment, she withdrew a folded piece of heavy drawing paper. She held it out to Ethan, her dark eyes wide and shy beneath the brim of her hat. He took it with trembling fingers, unfolding it slowly. It was another drawing. This time, the three of them, Ethan, Blaze, and Sophia, stood side by side beneath a wide sky streaked in bright blue and soft gold. A huge, smiling sun beamed down on them from the top corner rays of yellow crayon spreading out across the page. Blaze was drawn larger than the two humans combined, tail curled high eyes bright orange. Sophia had drawn herself with long, swirling hair and a pink scarf fluttering in the breeze. Ethan stood tall beside her gray beard, and all one hand resting on Blaze's massive head. Tears blurred his vision, turning the bright crayon colors into trembling watercolors that shimmered in the dim twilight. He blinked them away, clearing his throat as he struggled to find words around the tight knot rising there. Sophia stepped closer, placing a small gloved hand on his knee. When she spoke, her voice was a trembling whisper, each word ragged and soft but clear as ringing glass. You're my hero, Mr. Walker, she whispered. You and Blaze. You make me feel safe. Ethan's chest heaved with a silent sob, tears spilling down his weathered cheeks to dampen the collar of his flannel. His hand trembled as he reached out, brushing a gentle thumb across Sophia's rosy cheek. No, sweetheart, he whispered, his voice breaking with grief and hope, and something so bright it burned. You're the hero. You gave me a reason to wake up. Blaze let out a low, rumbling sigh, pressing his massive head against Sophia's small hip. She giggled softly, the sound trembling and shy but glowing with relief and joy. Her fingers curled into his thick fur, burying themselves in the warmth as she pressed her face against his skull. Sophia's mother reached down, brushing a gentle hand over Ethan's hair. We were thinking, she said softly, her voice trembling, maybe you'd like to come spend Christmas with us this year. Ethan blinked, tears shimmering in his eyes as he turned to look at her. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he nodded once slowly, the faintest flicker of a smile curling his cracked lips. I'd like that, he rasped, his voice shaking with emotion. I'd like that very much. Sophia grinned up at him, her small face glowing with pure, unfiltered joy. Blaze thumped his tail against the snow ears, flicking forward as he pressed closer against Ethan's side. The last threads of twilight slipped away, leaving only darkness scattered with faint flickering stars overhead. The clearing fell silent, wrapped in the soft hush of fresh snow falling through the branches. Ethan lifted his gaze to the forest beyond, watching as shadows deepened between the tall pines. The trees swayed gently in the winter breeze, whispering secrets through the still night. Snowflakes drifted down from the dark sky in silent spirals, settling onto Blaze's thick fur, onto Sophia's hat, onto Ethan's lined, tear-streaked cheeks. He let out a low, trembling breath, his chest heaving with grief and hope, and something brighter, something so clean it hurt. Thank you, Blaze, he whispered into the hush of the falling snow, his voice cracking with emotion. Because of you, I feel alive again. Blaze lifted his massive head, bright eyes flicking up to meet Ethan's gaze. For a single trembling moment, the old husky looked at him with a fierce, unbreakable love that burned so bright it lit up the shadows in Ethan's chest. Then Blaze turned his gaze upward to the dark, star-scattered sky. Snowflakes drifted down to settle on his broad head, catching in the silver streaks of his fur. His bright amber eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the faint light of a crescent moon peeking through the clouds. He let out a single low huff breath, steaming into the frozen air in a soft, quiet plume. Fade out. Snow continued to drift down through the silent clearing, swirling around the dark shapes of man, dog, and child. On the screen, in trembling white letters against the darkness, appeared a single sentence. Not all heroes wear capes. Some have 4 legs and a heart that never gives up. The credits rolled over the silent snowfall, the hush of the Oregon forest, wrapping the story in quiet, unbreakable grace.